I'm Ryan O'Dowd, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we continue with The Omega Seed by Paolo Soleri, Section 4.8. In Section 4.8 we will be finishing Book 2, An Eschatological Hypothesis. The Urban Effect. What is it that spills over from the formulation of a theological model, directly and imminently, into the condition of man? In pursuing such connection, it becomes useful to present and explain the urban effect. 1. When being becomes, time and space operate. As becoming fills space and grows in time, there is the explosion of the cosmos, the knot of the being, which unravels in space-time. 2. Within the general unraveling and on specifically apt subknots of becoming, the Earth for instance, life appears as a new type of nodule of perception-conscious self-perpetuation. 3. Since those nodules, those organisms, are eminently characterized by the same characteristics which are the main attributes of the city, they are cities, it has been found of important normative value to term the specific and distinct effect they portray the urban effect. 4. The urban effect is fundamentally that original phenomenon in which two or more particles of physical matter begin to interact in ways other than statistical and fatal, the laws of physics. That is to say, in ways which are organic or living and eventually instinctive, conscious, self-conscious, mental, cultural, and spiritual. The urban effect is the progressive interiorization and urbanization of the mass-energy universe, initially deploying itself in space-time, and eventually recollecting itself through the transfigurative process of evolution into spirit. The initial act of urban effect is the breaking of being into becoming, the first acknowledgement of otherness. It originates the space-time coordinates necessary to unravel the mass energy latent in the alpha being. The final act of the urban effect, at least exhausting space-time and the transfiguration of the last mass energy particle, is the denouement of becoming into the omega being. 5. The urban effect is the operative presence of that thrust which demands from each moment a next step which will disclose a more complex and integrated relationship within the relative parameters of space and time, a greater amount of vivifying stress, a greater degree of miniaturization. 6. This is a condition sine qua non, since eventually the resources represented by the mass-energy universe will exhaust themselves, and only a quasi-infinite complexity, a maximal miniaturization, will be sustained by the present energy field, then near zero. 7. Therefore, the omega being is a putiform being, outside of space and time as the alpha being is, omega having consumed space and time, and alpha not yet having been touched and eventually unraveled by them. 8. To be true to itself, the urban effect has to embody immanently, moment to moment, the norm of its own nature. Therefore, complexity and miniaturization are conditions sine qua non for the nature of the urban effect. 9. In the unlimited escalation of the urban effect, one can trace a reversal of the physical explosion of the universe into an implosive process, the outer limits of which will be the puntiform being omega. 10. This would be the yin-yang pulsation if it were not for the fact that the urban effect is nothing other than the total transubstantiation of mass energy into logos. The incarnation of logos is really the transcendence of mass energy, not into the civitas Dei, but the Dei civitas, the God city. It is not the case of logos pre-existing, descending into the flesh of the cosmos, but of the ascent, the etherealization of the flesh into the integrity of the urban effect by the creational escalatory evolution of intellection. What then is the imperative defined by the urban effect? The normative grid. The normative grid is not a rule of conduct, but a framework which, if accepted, can guide in establishing one's conduct, because it implies definite social, political, economic, and cultural orientations. 1. Since the eschatological model indicates that the responsibility of life is the transformation of the universe into logos, and since the urban effect is the mechanism by which the incarnation process has had its origins and its early development, the norm to abide is that one which sees the process sustained, extended, and intensified. 2. Therefore, the incarnation paradigm defines the urbanization of the universe as a mandatory process. At the end is the omega being in the resurrectional condition, logos. 3. The urbanizing of the human race is, therefore, not an expedient, but the expression of the essential stress of life and intellection towards less and less remote distance from the omega being. 4. Since the omega being is an anticipation and not a reality, its creation is contingent on the will and action of our intellection and that of others who might be elsewhere in the cosmos. 5. The urban nodes are approximations, remote approximations of Deus Civitas, the God City. They must exemplify more and more stringently the normative guidelines. 6. Those guidelines are delineated by the paradigm of complexity miniaturization, which is not purely methodological but defines, even if indirectly, meanings and priorities. 7. Effectiveness is the basic ingredient of urbanization. Therefore, the development of frugality is not expedient but is contextual to the urban effect. The frugal maximizes the effect proceeding from its own cause, and in its paroxysm does not simply maximize but makes the effect transcend the cause. The tangibility of this phenomenon is given in the aesthetic synthesis. 8. Since the eschatological model postulates creation as the development of evolution and not as the uncovering of a pre-existing creation, it will benefits the urban effect to be an escalatory, transcendental creational process in which the effect is not implicit or explained by the cause. 9. The norm is then not to set up causal stresses that will have the effect of giving us a closer look or contacting with an existing, if elusive, truth, but instead to recognize causal stresses ordained by the past, which have to be put to use by self-conscious life in ways which will render, even so slightly, less improbable the outcome of omega being. That is to say, not the pursuit of truth, but the creation causation of logos as the guiding norm. Editor's note. There is implicit here something pretty important, I think, to point out, or rather to highlight, which is Paolo Soleri is talking about the difference between the pursuit of truth, quote-unquote, itself, as in absolute reality understood and communicated, versus the creation of something that is real and useful. And of course, the creation of something that's real and useful is dependent on truth, but it isn't the same thing as pursuing that truth itself. It's like the difference between building a building and wondering what the meaning of a building is. This is a philosophy of activity and action that is causal and consequential. And it's the whole idea of the ascendancy of the omega being is that we will act in order to create it. It is a thing, in as much as it is real and as much as it is true. It is not simply the God of the past which we seek to understand. It is rather the God of the future that we build. We make it. That is the most important distinction and really the great innovation that Paolo Soleri is suggesting here and throughout this book. Moving on. 10. If the effect were in the cause, this creation would be a travesty. It is therefore indispensable for each condition to transcend itself so as to incarnate that which as yet is not, but is an anticipation. 11. To make creation the normative stress is then the imperative, even if not totally recognized moving force. 12. Creation is operative if there is a supportive structure that allows for its blossoming. The supportive structure is to be within the guidelines of the normative grid, which, as the term implies, has to have a normalcy of spatial deployment and temporal development. 13. What is normative, then, is not simply a code of behavior since it directly involves the space-time parameters. This is easy to understand because our perceiving, understanding, and responding are constricted and are constantly constructing around themselves the physical landscapes of civility or uncivility. 14. The behavior and the urban effect are distinct but inseparable. It is somewhat a sign of coarseness or arrogance on the part of the behaviorist and the social scientist to believe that the environment does not speak of social, political, economic, religious, and aesthetic commitments or directions. 15. Articulation of the message implicit in the urban landscape is the task that must be performed. With articulation, care must be taken not to dogmatize that which needs to remain ambiguous, since it is the principle of uncertainty which is to govern the quivering of matter in the process of transcending itself. 16. This ambiguity is to be upheld now more than ever, because it is now that the engineering of behavior tends to follow the steps of this engineering of instrumentality, the electrochemical technology. For the participant in the archaeological prototype project, the normative grid is to be taken as a serious definer of one's own actions. Nature of the process. To condense the proceeding, one can say that the nature of the process is the transformation of an original alpha state characterized by utter elementariness and utter isolation, the unlively and the unknowing, into a final omega state of utter complexity and utter integrity, the lively and the knowing. The process is endless, since it ultimately entails the participation transcendence of the whole cosmos. The process is creational, in the sense of flowing into ever new and improbable processes, moving further and further away from the original state alpha being to the approximate more and more the final state omega being. In order to define the process, intellection advances an eschatological hypothesis, which outlines the characteristics peculiar to the process. I call this the urban effect, as it focuses directly upon the human condition, and with which to develop a theological model. Participation in the process. Every living thing is participating in the process, consciously or not, willingly or unwillingly. But to be willfully and concretely part of the process, and to do so within the parameters of a human family beset by definite and specific wants, is to abide by the theological model and to define by it the normative grid. The normative grid outlines personal responsibilities which are maximally proposed by the Christian ethic, but which new ones are to be added. The personal responsibility. 1. Each person is a focal point, an urban effect, surrounded by a sea of looser traceries. This sea is in turn host to myriads of other focal points, one of which is the eye. 2. As a focus, things converge upon the eye and things diverge off of it. The eye is responsible within limits for both convergence, interception, and divergence radiance. 3. The eye is a correspondable parameter of what the eye becomes and what it broadcasts to the neighboring focal points. Eyes. 4. The right of the eye to be invested with a certain amount of benevolence is to be reflected in at least an equal amount of benevolence radiating from it. Otherwise, the total economy of the composite eye is stifled, flawed by parasitism, which is the destruction of that amount of benevolence absorbed, but not in turn radiated by the flawed eye. 5. On the other hand, if output only equates input, then the process becomes a steady state, and the loss of time that results is more substantive than the waste of personal life. Since it is a condition which echoes the nature of the Father, the original lifeless storehouse of mass energy, the alpha being. It is an entropic fall within the asentropic flight. 6. The dimming of personal radiance, which is the true damnation in store for it, is a constriction operating on the composite eye. A constriction declared by the rule in that the sins of the father will descend upon the children. 7. An opaque performance disavows the performer's position. It is up to the mercy of the composite to keep a parasite within its folds. Considering the wanting nature of each focus, it is obvious that charity turns out to be self-charity, and as such has to be evaluated and constrained, which are the intrinsic inner limitations of charity. 8. Forgiveness is eschatologically possible and desirable, forgetting is not. Since resurrection is unconditional, it includes as much the resurrection of the unforgettable action as the resurrection of the act of forgiveness. 9. Resurrection is not the replay of a tape which has been manipulated and thus rendered palatable, but the reenactment in utterly new light of the whole evolutionary span between alpha being and omega being, wherein every fragment becomes a portion of a clear thread woven into the warp of the space-time grid in total relatedness and now rendered infinitely small and infinitely short by the complexity miniaturization of omega being. The dignity of life in contentment or in sufferance can only be affirmed if individual action makes a difference, and for a difference to be true it has to cause a polarization, as small as necessary, of the future. What is in store at the end depends on the differentiating action. Otherwise, the dignity of the person is reduced to a bargaining capacity with this and that superpower, which ultimately will have the last word. In thy name I deliver myself. It is a limited dignity, a slave syndrome dignity. At best, it is the dignity of the object of revelation, setting itself at the task of obeying the command of the revealer. The dignity of the creational is something else altogether. Nothing will become which is not the specific personal responsibility of someone. All will end up to a possible, if improbable, ultimate denouement. The Omega being is none but the offspring of an immense mothering and fathering, or nurturing and loving, as stretching the full breadth of the time and space, consuming the full content of the universe, in the compassionate light of an ultimate total integrity and sensitization. The personal task is then an imperative responsibility, for which accountability is direct and focuses on the sufferance embedded in life, human and prehuman. We can certainly escape from this responsibility by becoming irresponsible. The unborn constituency. Since the eschatological hypothesis is predicted on the future as the uncreated bulk of reality, the whole process has to act today for the sake of tomorrow. Tomorrow has its own constituency. Who speaks for the unborn and with what authority? Since much ado is made of the right of the individual to have his or her voice heard and listened to, and since more and more of society's actions reach into the future, how is the universal suffrage meant in non-abusive terms? The right to life of the anti-abortionist crusade is an example, and perhaps not the most convincing, of a struggle put up by the future at the hands of present forces. Is a society that is oriented towards instant fulfillment and gratification capable of reaching decisions intended for and directed at the well-being of generations to come? Only by chance, when self-interest measured in political shifts, elections, or in very short processes happens to coincide with long-term improvements. Parts of the environmental battle which might improve fishing conditions or camping conditions, for instance. But in general, there cannot be true regard for the children of one's children when the most important index of well-being of a nation is measured by the gross national product. In terms of tragic imbalance, when famine and bleak poverty are finally perceived as unnecessary, societies have found leaders, Marxist and others, who were able to originate a commitment that made them transcend their own need, then so essential, and design and work for a more distant good. There has been much justifiable criticism of those movements that have promised little to the present for the sake of futures more human, but a good dose of Philistine self-pity is also traceable in the resistance to actions which are not immediately rewarding. The notion of personal responsibility is locked to the necessity of planning and implementing so as to transmit to the unborn effective premises for their actions. The feeble voices speaking for them need reinforcement, and reinforcement must come from deeds. The altruism implicit in such deeds need not be sacrificial, since there are substantive rewards intrinsic to the deeds themselves. But the rewards do not fit the mold of the behaviorist ethic, reward, punishment, reinforcement. This also applies to the realization that since the present shows no interest in the substance of the existential dilemma, one has to turn to future generations in the only way possible, staging of favorable conditions, those which might leave the best options open. This implies the acceptance of all the friction caused by the demand that people work perhaps against their strongest inclinations. The resurrectional conclusion of the eschatological hypothesis closes the cycle and sees responsibility flow into fulfillment, because it maintains that we will be resurrected only if our deeds and those of our progeny are up to the creative task of God-making. Therefore, by working for our progeny, we do work towards our own resurrection. Thus concludes that part. Moving on to Logos as the Omega Seed. Synopsis. Life, conscious, and spirit are not generated by other than themselves. They are a fatherless phenomenon, powerfully and irreversibly urging the winding up of the cosmos into the synthesis of divinity. What the process seems to suggest is that ultimately a universal genetic matrix, the Omega Seed of Resurrection, will contain the totality of all that has been. The self-seeding of evolution. The proposition is that reality is not so much an evolutionary unfolding as it is a seedless phenomenon, a fatherless offspring. In pursuing the creation of its own seed, reality will eventually reenact itself in the full self-knowledge and intrinsic to the resurrectional radiance of the ultimate tree, the offspring of the Omega Seed. The premise is that a seed, any seed, vegetal, animal, or human, which develops in the organism, vegetal, animal, or human, is a living instance of the complexity miniaturization paradigm and process. An ultimate being, the seed is at present a blueprint, a hypothesis, and therefore only a potential fulfillment. The conclusive ultra being is not the development in the force field of mass energy of the potential process packed in the seed's genetic matrix. It is instead the self-creating process whose aim is the causation of the final entity, the seed itself, in constant metamorphosis because it is pursuing its own image, its own entelechy. In the field of human concerns, the hypothesis which anticipates the seed is the theological concern, the what. The development, in accordance or discordance with it, is the technological concern, the how. The accounting, a posteriori, of the process and the feasibility models for its substance, the rationalization of the how, are the scientific concern. The assessment of the truth and impact of the theological concern, and the process of the actualization, science and technology is the philosophical concern, the why. The bits of transcendence scattered among the path blazed by the process are the aesthetic acts, fragments of the what. But this whole process is the same kind of process underpinning ontogenesis. That is why the human hypothesis is present in the first quivering of the earliest living substance. By the same token, the seed of the oak did not initially appear in final form, ready to go, but came about by mutational adaptive stages. In the perspective of the omega seed, the difference between the theological anticipation of the ultra being and the oak organism is that there were no prophets anticipating the oak species, since consciousness was still an unthinkable possibility. Therefore, though the ontogenesis of an oak tree is predefined by the acorn, the genesis of the oak species was not predefined. They could only be anticipated as omegas anticipated. Neither genesis fills a predefined niche in time-space. Neither is genetically determined. They go about creating their niches, creating themselves, that is. The eschatological hypothesis is an anticipation of that ultimate seed which nature, in its evolutionary development, has the power to produce as the whole cosmic tree being, the resurrected evolution of the universe. But if for the oak tree the process was to construct itself by selecting a few elements from the cosmos at large, then for the omega seed, the selection has to become a total participatory involvement in space-time of all the cosmos. Then, things appear to be as if the cosmos were like a tree, which is working at the production of that tiny kernel of substance which will contain in essence the tree in toto. Since the tree is self-creating, the true nature of the seed is as yet not only imperceptible but also inconceivable. Therefore, the seed is not at the origin but at the end. This explains why everything is beyond comprehension, since the matrix of the seed is nowhere to be found, if not in and by the conclusive act which will see it appear in the summer of time at the end of time. Reality is a seedless phenomenon engaged in the task of creating the seed, logos. Once the seed is created, reality will be able to repeat itself in all the singular variations peculiar to the individuals involved in the repetition. Each will be instantaneous, since all have lived precedently, but in the obscurity of fragmentation and not in the radiance of the total comprehensiveness and inclusiveness of divine ecstasy. Therefore, the difference between cosmogenesis and the growth of the oak tree is that while the tree can find itself by seeking itself according to its own genetic matrix, the cosmos has nothing like that to turn to. The cosmos is seedless, fatherless. It has to invent, indeed create, its own matrix. The anticipatory work of saints and prophets is like a kaleidoscopic blueprint which seeks to be such a matrix. The pursuit of the final total seed, logos, is consigned to different provinces of the real, so as to cause the advent of local seeds, those that could eventually come together for the conclusive implosion into logos. In speaking of the necessity of introducing more zones of automatism into the evolutionary process, is meant the intent of originating those new matrices, those new seeds, which will perform automatically from within, the living processes of ever-grading complexity, the self-seeding of evolution. But then, is this not the same process that constrained the determinism of matter to give way to the demonism of life and cause the creation, step by step, of the seed of a tree? The seed of a tree is the final monad, which has resulted from a tatumon, eons long, of elements belonging to the living kingdom assembling one link at a time into the genetic helix of that specific tree. It is therefore in the offspring, the chain of offspring, that the essence gathers, but at the origin what is to be found is not essence but longing, at most chance at least. That is the nature of the original divinity, the consequence of being, surprised in the act of becoming, and being anguished ever since by the awesomeness of the task of creating its own seed. The resolution has become total participatory involvement in time-space, the injection of meaning in every remote and dull corner, the loving metamorphosis into limitless understanding of a progressive total densification of complexity obtained by a progressive and total miniaturization. At the point of convergence of those two totalizations is the omega seed, explosively resurrectional and manifesting itself in the cosmic tree. Omega seed and resurrection. Most often, the poetry of religious fervor reveals more the nature of the author than the nature of the subject, God. Of him, one has the characterization as the creator, the loving maker, the careful administration, the invincible bastion against evil, and so on. My God has to be far more specific and awesome, totalizing, comprehensive, encompassing, being, acting, engulfing, performing the what, the where, the when, and the how, so as to be the why of its own whatness. Cosmically, it has to have the same kind of specificity one can find in the discrete genetic matrix of an organism. Isolating an organism from the rest of the world, one could imagine that the seed it carries is the repository of its history. That is to say, the evolutionary progression of acts, whose end product is the organism itself. But since such organism has not exhausted all there is as media for its own evolution, its own matrix not only is not cosmically whole, but is not in the position of reflecting its own history upon itself. It exists, but is not knowledgeable of its being. It is an end product, but not an instant of total recall, of being in itself and experiencing it, as a complete process that has eventually reached its own present identity. Its history is still made of past dead histories. Resurrection has not irradiated the matrix, and the matrix is a silent repository of a past, which has existence only in genetic archives. It is a contrived, synoptic, skeletal, disposable landscape stretching across immense spaces, immense times, and immense events. But the omega seed, if it is the genesis, comprehensive, conclusive, and all-consuming of the cosmos in toto, is then the genetic matrix of the real, a real made all-present in the consumed parameters of time, space, mass, energy. The seed has imploded within itself the whole creational process, which has brought the cosmos to omega. This resurrectional stage is then the specificity of the omega seed, inasmuch as it says unequivocally that the final conclusive act of the evolving cosmos is reactivation in the light of total understanding, e.g., enjoyment and sufferance of absolutely all the past, the history of every speck of has-been matter, and its participatory process of making the omega seed. From the most impersonal act, a stone being consumed into dust, to the most personal, private, and mental act, a person living his own life, all actions are reenacted as hierarchical parts of the evolutionary process, reenacted as conscious, knowledgeable co-authors of the whole being for all of them transparently perceivable to the hierarchical degree justly pertaining to each of them. The fact that the participation of the stone will still be a stony perception will be seen in that context, which will also see those same particles in the stone being involved, incarnation after incarnation, disincarnation, in making of lichens, birds, lions, humans, transhumans, and so on up to omega. Individuality will then not just be preserved, it will be bathed in the light of understanding, as in a sphere of transparent identification with all that has been an agent in the making of omega. Then one will experience the being of an atom, of a virus, of a flower, of a dinosaur, a forest, a galaxy, a Giotto, a Lincoln, a Christ, omega. In this infinite experience and the plenitude which comes with it are desirable, then it has to be made true. If this infinite experience is not given now, but assumed somehow in fragmented ways for our divinities, then it has to be made possible. If this infinite experience does not yet exist, since history is in the making, then it is not revelation which impinges on man as imperative, but rather its creation which imperatively presses upon man. If this infinite experience is a future, then science, the discipline of what is to be taken as instrumental in the divine beautifying process of the cosmos becoming grace. If this infinite experience is immensely more engrossing than our personal worth, then fulfillment is not in salvation but in the resurrectional omega seed. Therefore, the eschatological model of the omega seed is not intended to deal with the truth but with the desirable, intended to deal with the given but with the possible, intended to deal with the revealed but not with the creational, intended to deal with the scientific but not with the aesthetic, or intended to deal with personal salvation but with resurrection. Moving on. The resurrectional lens. The equity implied in the omega seed has to be absolute. Only with it can love be infinite. How can equity be absolute? It can, if the nature of resurrection is such as to render each exactly that intensity of recall which reflects the relative trueness of each. The desirability of Omega Seed has to be maximal, since the sufferance involved in its advent is also maximal. Such desirability would be perhaps disputable if the end result were simply understanding Logos, but if with the understanding comes also the expedience of the radiance of Omega, and its infinite capacity for recall within the light of an Omega perception, then Omega Seed is irresistibly desirable. Who would not want to be all in everything, while knowing all in everything to the degree of one's own trueness? Since resurrection is not a survey of the past, but is the past being lived in the present of Omega, as it has never been experienced before. Totally knowledgeable, i.e. totally loving, a trans-ego trip. Then it is in the condition where the fullness of life, from the most primeval to the most complex, is fully and ab aeternum performed. This performance will not entail simply the reliving with astonishing brilliance of each life and by each life, but the reliving in utter ecstasy by each life of all other lives, to the degree of one's trueness again. Through the resurrectional lens, each particle will relive be all other particles in all their most particular vicissitudes. Since motivations and drives, intents in action, will be integral parts of the equation, the justness of the reliving and redoing will be, by definition, the supreme justice of Omega Seed, where nothing gets forgotten but all is forgiven, loving. Where the notion of Logos might be wanting is in the possible act of the experiential side of the Omega Seed. Omega Seed does not just know, it is also all that it knows, and since it knows all, it is also all. It is all of its becoming, since it is the genetic matrix of all, not a synopsis of all, but the actual total self of evolution. The cactus out there in the ground reenacts itself in the Omega Seed. Then is the polarity of the cosmos in all of its originality now transmuted in all its universality. Then the cactus in all finds itself to be the means for its own end and for all other ends, and in such a position sharply focuses upon its own specificity as forever impregnated of finality, a true end in se and per se. This end is not shelved away in some cosmic archive, but is instead alive and kicking in the resurrectional radiance of Omega Seed. But in a way, unless such grace is reached, the end nature of the cactus in all is so ambiguous as to become irrelevant. The final act is the one which transfigures all the means of the process into an endless and awesome tidal wave of ends. Thus concludes Logos as the Omega Seed. Thus concludes Book 2, An Eschatological Hypothesis, Section 4.8, The Omega Seed by Paolo Soleri. Now, at the end of this book, there are a lot of charts. I am going to scan them into my computer and try to scatter them throughout the images on the actual video. I'm also going to include them independently as pictures when I share them on the Facebook and the Instagram and the Twitter pages. So, there you go. Thus concludes Section 4.8 of The Omega Seed by Paolo Soleri. Tomorrow, Section 4.9, the beginning of Book 3, Space and Man. I will see you then. Alam.